Welcome everyone to another episode of Index Office Hours. It is episode 58 and the date is Tuesday, the 26th of April. Thank you all for attending. This is being recorded, so keep that in mind as we go out throughout today's conversation. We love participation, and so if you'd like to make some comments on any of the topics, please raise your hand if you're in the audience or unmute your mic if you're already on stage. This is going to be a very interesting episode. There's a lot to talk about. We have some amazing guests who have joined us today, so thank you all for attending. Very much excited to run today's Indexer office hours. So without further ado, let's jump into the opening remarks. As always, we do a nice shout out to 𝗨𝗪𝗂𝗧, and this week's episode, I should say, was from Raphael, who's the CEO and co-founder of 𝗨𝘀𝗲𝗂. 𝗨𝘀𝗲 is a easy to use interface to track all of your DeFi activity. And what I found to be interesting about that particular episode, it was episode 61, was that Raphael, in his interview, was mentioning that there was two options for building 𝗨𝘀𝗲. One is to, create his own indexing setup in this kind of like walled garden fashion, or to use the graph. And throughout the episode, he mentioned that the logistics of setting up his own operation would just be too high relative to using an open marketplace protocol like the graph. And so for me, it highlighted the fact that the work that we do is very foundational for the ecosystem, and it wouldn't happen without any of you lovely indexers. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend go checking it out, because it definitely reminded me personally of how important the work that we do is here for empowering the entire Web3 DeFi ecosystem. So as we move on to the second part of opening remarks, I want to give another shout out to Graph Day. That is happening June the 2nd. Wave 2 tickets are out, so if you haven't got your tickets, guys, please do get them before they run out. There is also the hackathon going on through the 3rd of June to the 5th, so make sure to be a part of that. So that's everything for opening remarks. I'll now hand it over to Anna to take us into Repo Watch.
Thank you, Abel. So hello everyone, and welcome to our regular segment Repo Watch. As always, links to release notes and PRs that we'll be talking about can be found in the agenda. And before we start with major blockchain clients, I want to remind you again that we recently updated the flow a bit to only mention the clients that have had new releases. This is just to move faster and in the interest of time. All other repos can still be found on the agenda with all of the details of their last release, but they will not be mentioned in the Repo Watch. So, on our major blockchain client, we have had some big changes from 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀, and because we will be covering the first alpha release of 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀 2.0, we have split the 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀 client to cover both version 1 of 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀 and version 2 moving forward. So with that in mind, let's start. So on 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀 2.0, we have had a new release, version 2022-04-03 alpha. And we had quite a few warning here, but since Chris will be covering the direction 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀 is moving towards later in this episode, I've kept this detail brief. So the things you need to know about this release. So one warning, you cannot upgrade your existing 𝗨𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀 database that was built by one of the previous beta releases. So if you are going to try this alpha release, you will need to sync from scratch, since the data models will be incompatible. You will also need to use Golang version 1.18 for this release. And if you do need to use Golang version 1.17 for any reason, a workaround will be available in a future release. So if you have that requirement, wait for another alpha release. You will no longer need to run an RPC daemon in a separate process with 𝗟𝗀𝗀𝗧 2.0, but instead you will be able to use the embedded RPC daemon, which is on by default. And you can disable this behavior by setting the HTTP CLI flag to false. This release also contains additional details and implementation of BitTorrent protocol. So this was 𝗟𝗀𝗀𝗧 2.0. For 𝗟𝗀𝗀 1, just a quick reminder, we haven't had a release now, but the last release we have had was version 2022-0402 beta. And my understanding is that there won't be as many beta releases moving forward. For the rest of the major blockchain clients, we haven't had any new releases. Moving on to GraphStack. For GraphNode, we haven't had a new release. Last one has been version 0.26.0. However, there are two pull requests that are worth being mentioned. So pull request number 3490, it's a new PR, and it assumes that any message with revert in it is a deterministic error in order to avoid having to whitelist each message. This PR addresses some issues, a couple of issues. Thank you for submitting, Leo. And yeah, I suggest everyone should check out this PR. Pull request 3483, new pull request coming from Yanis. Thanks for submitting. And it uses a try from method when decoding Ethereum Firehose blocks, and then handles the error by retrying the same block over and over again with an exponential backoff. Before these changes, GraphNode would crash completely. So this is a retry mechanism. That's all we have for GraphNode. And for indexer service and agent, we haven't had any new releases. Last release has been 0.19.0, which is a pre-release. And unlike other weeks, we're quite light on indexer service and agent, so I'm not updating you guys on any PRs or issues. Has anyone had any good or bad upgrade experiences or anything they'd like to report regarding the changes we've just mentioned?
Yeah, so we are syncing the latest 𝗟𝗀𝗀𝗧 2 alpha release in our cluster. We'll cover 𝗟𝗀𝗀𝗧 2 in a little bit more detail later, but they have a new snap sync process that downloads snapshots using BitTorrent, which in theory should make the sync process a lot faster, but from what I've seen, it's actually pretty slow. That said, it did complete and then moved on to replaying history to generate the state, and all seems to be going pretty well. But yeah, it was quite slow. Following along in the 𝗟𝗀𝗀𝗧 Discord, it is a known issue and has to do with the torrent implementation and how peers are handled. So I think fixes are coming soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else?
Well, pretty much the same experience here. Started extremely slow. BitTorrent at this stage is actually slowing things down, but yeah, eventually they might fix it.
Yes, that's my understanding as well. Okay, well, if there's nothing else from anyone regarding Repo Watch, I will hand over to Protocol Watch to Juan.
Thanks, Anna. Hey, so Protocol Watch, I'm trying to keep it as short as possible, but we have a few things to cover up today. So yeah, first of all, contract repository. There's a new PR to basically add a task for the hard hat tasks to print some payloads for signals and stuff. Nothing really major, it's mostly for development work. Then going into the core network subgraphs, there's a cool PR from Michael to add some extra parsing logic so that it's easier to search for subgraphs. He made a tool that uses these changes, and we are basically integrating it to the core network subgraph so that the feature is also available to anyone that syncs it. It's super useful if you want to search for particular subgraphs that sync a few known contracts, or maybe have some new events, known events that you might be interested in. So yeah, it's super useful. And it will be integrated very soon as we polish a few details. There's also a notable mention. There was a critical error today with the network subgraph that brought the service for a few hours. It was a particularly difficult to spot error due to some issues with the loggings and stuff, but we managed to fix it. It has to do with the current manifest parsing of the subgraph deployments, which is done so that we can have the schema available in the subgraph. Unfortunately, there was an invalid manifest published, and the algorithm wasn't expecting it, so yeah, it broke. It's now working, but this didn't affect non-IPFS versions of the subgraph at all. So anyone that was syncing one of those, basically all indexers, should not be affected by this issue at all. The affected deployments are now fixed, so nothing to worry about now. Going into forum governance, there's a new GAP, GAP 30, which is minimum curation amount for indexing rewards eligibility. This, I think it has to do with the work that Ricky, Craig, and some of the Prism group have been working on. So yeah, do you want to say anything about it, Ricky, or?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much covered kind of the TLDR. Yeah, so the proposal is to make subgraphs with a curation signal below 500 GRT not eligible for indexing rewards to basically deter a potential attack. But yeah, I mean, if I can take 2 or 3 minutes, I'd be happy to provide some context on it. But if there's no room in the agenda for today, I'd basically just encourage everyone here to review the proposal and provide your perspective on the forum.
I think we might be able to leave it for the ending of the episode if there's an extra space. But I think you pretty much covered it all. So yeah, thanks, Ricky.
I'll just add that Ricky and Craig did a great presentation in the last core devs call. So watching that video is also a really great resource there.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's super useful. Moving forward, GAP 28, subsidized query settlement. We talked about this a lot in a few of the past episodes. There's a new comment from Chris regarding new trust assumptions for the gateway if a new implementation would require validation of the vouchers by the gateway in a way that would make it so that that particular validation would basically decide whether or not you're going to be receiving indexing rewards. So yeah, that's it. Moving into forum research, we have a little bit of discussion regarding principal protected bonding curves. Zach added a few lines of feedback. It was quite interesting, and I also kind of like ended up on the same line of thought as he did by pure chance, I guess. So it was an interesting conversation. I think, Brandon, you might have some things to add to that discussion. But for now, since we want to keep this brief to be able to accommodate for all of the new things that we are going to be discussing today, I'll just leave it at that. And if we have some extra time at the end, we can probably discuss this. Moving into the pinboard, there's, I think you, Chris and Anna might want to cover the Aragon backwards incompatibility changes to the database storage layout, right?
Yep.
I'll hand it over to you then.
Cool, thanks, Juan. Hey, everyone. I'm briefly going to talk about some changes that the Aragon team has announced that are coming to the Aragon ecosystem, and obviously that affects all of us. in a substantial way. So as Anna mentioned at the beginning, moving forward, we'll be keeping track of two variants of Aragon. Aragon 1, which will continue to see beta releases for some time up until the merge. And then Aragon 2, which will carry us past the merge, and generally is kind of like the next generation of Aragon client. As you, I'm sure, know already, Aragon 2 releases are not compatible with the Aragon 1 database. So upgrading from Aragon 1 beta to an Aragon 2 alpha release will require a resync. And the early indications are that there may not be compatibility across storage for Aragon 2 alpha releases as well. So you may need to resync across those alpha releases as we get closer to the merge. Why this change? Why Aragon 2? As you might expect, it's really just to bring the client back into an alpha state, to incorporate the learnings of Aragon 1 into the client and build back towards stability. The other really interesting learning or insight that they've highlighted, that I'll also highlight, because I think it very much echoes the learnings of the Firehose and some of the insights that have come out of our own work in this area. And that is that Aragon 2 wants to move towards a database model, right? Like a state model where state history, as well as indices across the database, have transaction granularity instead of block granularity. And the key insight there is that blocks are really just a consensus marker, right? They're a convenience in the sense that they allow the network to come to consensus on, kind of batches of change at a single time. But beyond that, it's really, blocks are really just about consensus. And when you look at the workload that you typically direct towards a node, it's a user workload, and users, don't care so much about blocks; they care about transactions. And so Aragon 1 and generally, the blockchain node implementations that exist out there have their indices modeled around blocks. And the problem there is that when you're looking up something transaction related, a block index only gets you as far as the block. And going any further, right, kind of drilling down into the transaction data in the node database, that block index really doesn't help you. And so interestingly, the performance of resolving transaction data is actually inversely correlated with the number of transactions in that particular block. And so Aragon 2 has kind of recognized this, and will be moving towards a database model that really kind of prioritizes transactions and lays out indices with respect to transactions and not just blocks. And this should bring very significant performance benefits around historical queries, and any methods that are transaction specific, like the trace filter method, for example, should see very substantial performance increases. Now that's obviously quite a huge change, and it's certainly not the only change that will be introduced. And so the team has announced that Aragon 2 will be coming in 3 kind of major upgrades. Personally, I expect that we'll see a few releases across each upgrade. And then the first upgrade has actually already been released. That's what Anna talked about earlier. This particular upgrade introduces some pretty interesting changes. Firstly, the internal database structure has changed and has introduced some more novel compression and data encoding techniques. And so, it's staggering. We went from an Open Ethereum archival trace node requiring more than 8 terabytes of NVMe storage to Aragon 1, which took that down to about 2 terabytes. And with this first release of Aragon 2, a full archive trace node for Ethereum mainnet is now about 1.2 terabytes. So, incredible data engineering that they've done to get all of that data down in size. Anna also mentioned that this release embeds a JSON RPC capability into the stateful node process, so that's no longer something that you have to run separately, although of course it's still possible and in many cases desirable to run an independent pool of RPC daemons. The other big change is that there's a snap sync implementation. So in Aragon 1, you had to download all of the chain history over dev P2P, Ethereum 1's P2P implementation, and then replay the chain history to compute the state. With SnapSync, all of this is actually downloaded using BitTorrent. And so the node, will not only use BitTorrent to download those, all of that historical data, but it will also automatically seed that data as well. So as more and more people adopt Aragon 2, the speed of sync should increase substantially. In this release, that mechanism downloads block headers, bodies, transactions, and a lookup index. But today it does not include state history snapshots or event log or call trace indices. The client will still, replay all of the state, build those indices, and replay the history, not the state, and build the state and build the indices. The other big thing in this first upgrade is that there is support for syncing BSC, which is a tremendous change. Before I talk briefly about the next two upgrades, does anyone have any comments or questions about that?
Not so much a comment or a question, but just a request to forward if you could mute your mic, please. That'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, so moving on, the second upgrade, which of course hasn't come out, and we'll probably see a few releases of Aragon 2 before we get kind of second upgrade release. Obviously, the kind of detail starts to dwindle here because these things are a bit further out, but further improvements to the database and SnapSync snapshot formats are expected. So that's further improvements to the encoding and compression techniques. SnapSync will also include snapshots of event log indices and call trace indices, meaning that the node will need to do less work to get synced. This second upgrade is where the kind of significant change to transaction granularity indices will happen. So I believe that the existing release still uses block indices, although the internal storage layout has changed substantially. And at least today, the logic in the node relating to producing SnapSync snapshots and seeding those is quite simplistic. And so upgrades to that are expected, where the node will kind of automatically generate snapshots as the chain progresses and begin to seed them via BitTorrent. In this second upgrade, the state, the database state will still need to be computed by replaying history. So SnapSync will really just be about bootstrapping as much of that data as quickly as possible, but a full replay will still be required. And then finally, the third upgrade will, to be honest, much of the same. So again, further improvements to the snapshot and database formats. And then the kind of major change, I would say, is the expectation that state snapshots will be added to SnapSync so that nodes will not need to do a full replay of history to compute state. They can download like a recent snapshot of state and then just replay the history since then to get the state up to the head of the chain. And again, further improvements to the management of those snapshots and seeding them, and some of the features that are planned there are things like merging smaller snapshots together, reseeding, and just generally making older components of history more efficient to snap sync as the chain progresses. Yeah, that about covers it. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about this very important upgrade? I'll say as an indexer that's looking to support BSC and Polygon and other high throughput chains, we already operate full nodes across some of these chains, and full nodes are fairly easy still to handle. But we haven't, while we have a Polygon archive node, we haven't even attempted BSC archive because it seems so unwieldy. And yeah, Aragon support for BSC and Polygon, I just think is a huge deal for making indexing those chains more accessible to more indexers.
It does indeed. It does indeed. Everyone's quite quiet today. Wonderful. So, Cohen, you want to speak to something?
Yeah, I wanted to say that somewhere in the release notes, it also hints that the snap sync would actually, specifically for some of these big chains, slightly reduce the storage space even further. And it's in fact the 𝗨𝗀𝗀𝗳𝗂 2 that is gonna be the first step on the roadmap before they can properly support BSC and Polygon. So yeah, that's definitely something to look forward, because those archive nodes are brutal as hell. Yeah, that's definitely something to look forward to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something else that is not immediately obvious on the surface is, today there is no way to do, at least as far as I'm aware, there's no way to trace a call on BSC. There's just no client that supports tracing calls. Yeah, thanks for confirming, Cohen.
Same for Polygon. They're all GET clones basically. So, and GET doesn't have the tracing that we have in Open Ethereum. They have tracing in terms of yeah, it's more a debug method than the tracing that we know in Open Ethereum. So yeah, in the current implementations, it doesn't exist. I know that a long time ago when I was starting with BSC, I saw an Open Ethereum port for BSC, but that already looked dead. And that's a year ago. So yeah, that's pretty much a non-starter, especially since Open Ethereum is also end of life. So
yeah, and Aragon 2 actually gives full tracing capabilities to these chains.
It does.
Yeah, and that is a huge deal. So excited to see that. And in quite a granular way as well, like the pruning options, you can be really precise about which aspects across, transaction indices or like transaction hash lookups to, log data to trace and call data. You can be really granular about, what you prune and how much you keep.
Yeah, the only thing to keep in mind about pruning with Aragon is that you need to set it before syncing, otherwise you will likely have to sync from scratch. So if you want the prune node on Aragon, make sure you get your stuff right before starting to sync. Otherwise, it's start from scratch.
Cool. Thanks, Cohen. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything on this? Okay.
Well, maybe I just express a general concern about the upgrade plan and the roadmap from Aragon 2. They're doing very large changes, changing the data format, the database format. And then as indexers, we'll have to be very careful and we'll have to be on the lookout for incompatibilities and breaking changes on the RPC responses. I'm not saying there won't be, but we saw in the history of Aragon that, especially in the early days, it took a while before reaching parity with Open Ethereum for the traces. We'll have to make sure that it remains the same, and I think we'll have to make sure that we, if we don't have the habit already, we'll have to make sure to test these releases on test setups before going to mainnet. I'm personally trying to figure out how I will approach that. But yeah, I think generally speaking, we need to be careful. Aragon has been extremely stable and useful recently. Hopefully, it will stay as good, even though they're going through these major changes.
That's a really excellent point. I feel like we're in another one of these tricky situations as we were in with the transition from OE to Aragon. I I don't know how to feel about this, but in some sense the problem will disappear because at least today, OE continues to, it's largely unsupported and undeveloped, though it's still feasible to run. The moment the merge happens, Aragon 2 will be the only Ethereum or EVM client capable of providing transaction trace data. And yeah, so whatever it says becomes the kind of de facto answer, and we lose the opportunity to compare responses.
Yeah, at least we won't have diverging POIs, but maybe there will be a functionality that will break along the way. We'll have to be on the lookout.
This is fine. Thanks, Naviba. Back to you, Abel.
Amazing. Thank you so much. As you've passed it on to me, I'm going to switch it back to Juan, who's going to bring us into the data and API section of our 5-part series. As many of you who joined us last week would have experienced, we spoke a bit about the R&D roadmap, specifically the data and APIs part. We got into the conversation. It was very meaty and it was very, very interesting, but unfortunately we didn't have much time to wrap up the entire conversation, so this is a follow-on. So Juan, without further ado, take us away.
Thanks, Abel. So quick recap before we start with this. We covered the data and APIs working group, at least a small fraction of the data and APIs working group last episode. We've discussed a little bit about indexing performance, upgrades that are planned, and some indexing performance upgrades that have been already released with David here. We've also covered slightly a little bit of the Firehose releases that are coming soon, and some of the things that those releases are enabling, like, for example, non-EVM indexing on some chains, and possibly in the future having Firehose for actually EVM-like networks. So yeah, we will be... I'd like to first open up the discussion, given that we've had to cut short last episode. If anyone else has some questions regarding those two sections of the data and APIs working group, it would be super cool to have that discussion first, so we can then proceed to the next sections. I'll take the silence as no one having any doubts about the new improvements on indexing performance or Firehose related features. We can circle back to this after the discussion if we want anyways. So what we wanted to cover today was the three other sections from the data and APIs working group that we had no time to cover last episode. These three sections are the graph client, which is, I think, being actively developed by the guild. It's a way to improve. It's basically a dedicated tool to make it easy to build dApps and subgraphs by wrapping and abstracting all the operations supported by GraphQL API. This is basically adding things like built-in improved network fallbacks, analytics and aggregations features, adding also client-side composition, which would be super useful for dApps that need many different subgraphs and compose all those subgraphs in a single query, or maybe compose some kind of like aggregations that you would need to pre-process in your subgraph that are actually very expensive. Being able to do some client-side composition at that level would greatly improve the experience. So the graph client, I think it's being actively developed by the guild. It's one of the parts of the one of the sections for this working group. I see Adam joining. I don't know if you have anything to add to the this particular section.
Something that I'll add is, one of the objectives of the graph client is to roll state channel support into the client, and this paves the way for us to cut the gateways out of the equation, where effectively the end user would actually be able to make GRT query payments directly. But of course, for that to happen, you need some code on the client that's actually capable of facilitating those state channel payments. So yeah, it's an important piece in unlocking that longer term vision.
Totally. Also, subscriptions, which are not very usable right now, I think, are part of the graph client, as well as client-side composition and some other new features.
Yeah.
I don't know, Dotan's not here, so I don't know how much we can have as a discussion, an open discussion for this section. Do you have anything to add, Chris?
Yeah, I think the graph client is a huge deal, and at least like one of the places where I'm really passionate about the graph client is, like as much as we want the graph to eat the whole blockchain data problem, because we always want to deliver the kind of products and services that we create in a decentralized context, we need to maintain that property of permissionlessness, and therefore we need some means of like verifying and providing guarantees around data integrity, and therefore we need to ensure determinism. So there's like this whole cascading set of design constraints that make it quite difficult to incorporate data into subgraphs that is not deterministic or doesn't have data availability guarantees or things like that. And so that's certainly not a problem for data that originates kind of inside of Web3 on blockchains, on like new age data storage platforms and things like that. But obviously that's not where all the data actually comes from, and often there is the need to kind of layer in or incorporate data that comes from centralized sources or data that just by its nature would be difficult for us to kind of build into the subgraph ecosystem. And a way that a lot of integrators have approached this today is that they have some backend API, and that backend API effectively wraps subgraph endpoints, and maybe on the server does some composition and kind of like layers in that additional data, but that throws away a lot of the benefits of querying a decentralized network, and it kind of re-centralizes everything around this server-side wrapper and makes it a single point of failure and blah blah. Like it's just not a pattern that really makes sense. And I think that the Graph client lays the groundwork for doing things the right way. And that is, at least in my opinion, for all of that composition to be done on the client, such that if you're building a dApp or something, the kind of vast majority of data that's core to your application, would be in a subgraph and would be derived from deterministic sources that you can index in the subgraph. But yeah, you might want to pull in some other things, and with the Graph client, you can effectively do that. You can create a unified schema. You could potentially still have your centralized API that maybe you can't do what you want to do purely on the client, and you need to kind of scrape a subgraph and compute over some aggregates, or do something in a big database. And you can still serve that data via a centralized API, but rather than middlemanning the subgraph, you can do all of that joining and composition on the client, and that preserves all of the properties that we care about in terms of a decentralized service to query blockchain data, but also gives you the ability to layer in all of the kind of centralized data that you might need. And if your centralized API goes down, sure, your application will be affected in the sense that those data points won't resolve, but all of the ones backed by the subgraph will continue to resolve. And so you can also build applications that are more resilient and just offer a better user experience. That was really long-winded, so sorry.
No worries, it's always super useful to have all that context. I actually didn't know all that, so it's super amazing that so much work is being done to support all of those use cases. Moving forward, we'll have the open discussion just later, but I want to cover at least all 3 sections first. So moving forward, one of the next sections is new data sources. This is basically work being done to allow for some off-chain data sources as well as multi-blockchain. Multi-blockchain is also requiring some particular things from other working groups, like the Epoch Block Oracle, from the operations, protocol and network operations working group. So there's a little bit of dependencies there, but it allows for parallel work being done. So yeah. Regarding all the multi-blockchain and off-chain data sources, we've been having a lot of new support for new chains that are non-EVM particularly, but we haven't been able to move that to the centralized network yet. So there's a lot of work being done there to enable that, as well as having IPFS and some other data sources like RWIP, for example. So yeah, that section of the working group would be aiming towards those changes. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
No, not from my side, but I wonder whether Adam or David or yeah, we have so many people on the call that I think.
Yeah, totally. I guess we could leave it for the open discussion then. And then to cover the last section of the data and APIs working group, there's a section called Subgraph Developer Experience, which particularly being a subgraph developer, it's always amazing to see these particular sections. So there's a lot of work being done for the past few months and also in the future regarding new ways to improve the developer experience for subgraph developers. In particularly, one of the things that I would like to highlight is unit and integration testing being added and improved all the time. We already have Matchstick, and it's always nice to see that it's being constantly improved and it's part of the roadmap for the future. This allows for faster development times for subgraph developers, since it was always painful to have to deploy your subgraph and wait for it to index to do anything meaningful. You now can do a lot of things with Matchstick, and feature improvements for it would be greatly appreciated, as well as having new hard-hat plugins, but also having native time series support. I know that many subgraph developers end up doing the same thing over and over, like adding daily data entities as well as weekly data entities, which are often used in subgraphs, kind of like the Uniswap subgraph did. That's all gonna be a thing of the past when new developments are deployed. So yeah, that's always nice to hear. Now that we have covered all the three missing sections of the working group, I would like to open the discussion for all of the working group, including indexing, performance, and Firehose, since we have David here too, as well as Ford, Adam, so many great faces to have here. So I would like to open the discussion for everyone, so feel free to ask anything.
Yes, just to echo that, anyone in the audience, if you'd like to come up, feel free to raise your hand, and obviously everyone already on the stage, feel free to mute your mic if you'd like to. Oh, we've got one request. Cool.
Hello, everyone. Hello, anybody hear me?
Yes, you're a bit choppy, but we can make out what you're saying.
So yeah, I'm one of the developers that use the subgraph in my day-to-day work. I think it's a great project, and I was kind of I'm looking for a solution. I was thinking if there's a way you can actually use this subgraph as a layer, like a GraphQL layer on top of an Ethereum archive node. So because there are some data that want to access on the blockchains, like let's say for instance I want to get the creator of a contract. I mean that's have to go like I have to like look through back to the block that contract was deployed, or I have to log in transactions from scratch. I mean on the entire blockchain to be able to know who deployed the contract. So I was thinking if there's a solution like a layer that can help people structure queries directly to the Ethereum archive node. Or if probably that's something you guys looking at.
Hey, thanks for your question. So there are definitely others who can provide more detail. I'm just going to mute you. I don't think that subgraphs are kind of exactly there to like provide a GraphQL interface over an archive node. Like the intention is that there would be some indexing that happens in the middle. That being said, I would guess that contract like deployer addresses are probably something that you can resolve inside subgraph mappings and index. I don't know how feasible it would be today to create a subgraph that indexes all contract deployments. My guess would be probably not very feasible. But the Firehose, which is a new ingestion backend for GraphNode and subgraphs, may make that a lot more feasible than it is today. If anyone else wants to comment, please do.
Okay, that's nice. Because I heard I heard something about Vitalik. They can possibly use the graph node as a support to scale Ethereum, I mean DeFi projects. So yeah, I mean that was when the question came in. I mean I was like wondering if probably there's a team working on this that I could join, or I mean if there's any plan to head towards that direction. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
I said I heard some time ago about Vitalik Buterin talking about using the graph to scale DeFi projects. So that was when I started wondering about how possibly we can have a graph layer to interact with an Ethereum archive node to fetch dynamic data using queries directly. So yeah, if I mean that's like out of scope of where the graph is going. I mean, probably then it's something that's left untouched. And yeah, I'll do more research into that and see.
Cool, thank you. Do you mind muting yourself?
Yeah.
I'll handle.
Okay, I've muted you forcibly. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but yeah, shout if you would like to. Yeah, just to follow up on that, I would certainly say that the graph is probably one of the most significant enablers of DeFi scale today. I think it's fair to say that the majority of DeFi already uses the graph to display data in their front ends and produce analytics and data for analysts and customers. But the intention is very much that to maybe just clarify, like, subgraphs do ultimately get their data out of an Ethereum archive node, but that data is then indexed, and when you subsequently query a subgraph API, that request is not being routed through to an archive node because the requests to the archive node to index the data have already happened, and it's effectively cached in the graph node database. So maybe that's kind of a detail to clarify. So yeah, I hope that helps. Thanks for the question.
I think the question was kind of like the discussion about EIP 44444. But yeah, it's a good discussion. I want to echo the question that Vince did on stage chat, since he's not able to use voice chat now. He said he'd like to bring up the goodwill indexers that have been launched on the network run by Agent Node. And would it be possible to run the PO fire on these, as they index almost all subgraphs and jump on new ones quickly? It would provide quite a robust POI depth for the indexers to compare POIs. I think it could be done, right? I'm not entirely sure how difficult that would be to implement.
Yeah, I think we need to ask Martinez, but I think that may be doable. Yeah,
it would. There would be like a side effect as to you'd have to take them as a grain of salt, right? Because otherwise you would be taking it as the source of truth for POIs, even if they have issues on the infrastructure, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think there's like necessarily an assumption that those are always 100% correct. What would be required to open up the indexers to the POI fire tool? I have not done that myself yet.
Not entirely sure.
There's a Docker container that wraps a Python client, and it just needs to be spun up, in the same cluster as GraphNode, and it will periodically scrape GraphNode for POIs and then post them off to the POIFire server.
Okay. I'd have to check in with Martinez, but my gut would say that so we're at Edgenode working on another tool for comparing POIs. We're going to be using that internally for integration testing, as well as releasing that for network use. I'm not sure exactly when that's done, but I think that'll be done within the next 2 weeks. So I think we would probably rather use that tool and wait to do that development, the DevOps work for using that. But I'll get back to you guys on that. In general, 100% support the idea of sharing the backstop indexers POIs with the network.
Yeah, that would be greatly appreciated, I think. I think that there are some other indexers in the network that are doing something similar to the backstop indexers. I don't know. I don't remember if P2P had a separate like indexer that indexed every single subgraph, but that could be also added to the PFI or whatever solution we're using, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing. Does anyone have any other question regarding the working group? We are on the top of the hour, but maybe we can squeeze a little bit more.
Just on that point, 𝗨𝗀𝗪𝗀 has been kind enough to offer to help out with the recording, and he mentioned that he has another meeting after this. Unless there, no worries at all. So unless there are some uber pressing questions, I would say we'd probably wrap up now, if that's okay. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of you for attending today's IOH. Very much appreciate all of the engagement and conversation here. I just want to wrap up by saying we have a POAP for you all, and here's the secret word. It is indexing queries. That is indexing queries. So make sure to download the POAP app and get your POAP. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's another episode. We're going to close it right now. Thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to seeing you next week.